outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Welcome to Teach Talk Radio. I'm Jamie Clark. This is the Saturday Show live. Today we have a really special guest who is Amarbeer Singh Gill, who's joining us today on strengthening the student toolbox. That's our show name today and our theme today. Super excited to get into the research on Dunlosky's work. So if you're joining us live, welcome. You are free to interact with us today and shoot through any questions you might have for Singh today, which is going to be really interesting for him to answer them. And if you're not watching this live, don't worry. Obviously, this is going to be a podcast and a recording as well, and you'll be able to check that out on my playlist on YouTube and also on the Teachers Talk Radio podcast. So before we get into today's conversation with Singh, I just want to talk to you about our wonderful sponsors. In case you are unaware, we are sponsored by the wonderful John Catt Educational. John Catt Educational, if you don't know, are the publishers of professional development books. They are the publishers who are known pretty much worldwide for really practical books on professional development, including the In Action series, which Singh's book is part of. In fact, just as a little prop today, I've brought them all along for you to see. I've pretty much got the full collection, and I'm sure that Tom Sherrington will be really proud of me. So if you're watching, Tom, please give us a retweet, and please give us a like for this particular show. But yeah, this is the one we're going to be talking about today with Singh. It's really accessible, it's really practical, and if you're interested in the In Action series or any other book from John Catt, including my own, which is Teaching One Pages, which is on Amazon and the John Catt Bookshop, then please visit them. Go to johncattbookshop.com. You can explore the full range of titles, and guess what? On your screen, you've also got the code JCTTR2425, and you can get 20% off. 20% off your order. So please hop on to the website, check it out, and order away, because I know that most of you who are watching are on summer holidays, and I'm not. It's raining here. I'm in Perth. The weather's not great. It's winter. And I'm seeing all these posts from social media about holidays abroad in Spain, in Greece, and wherever, and I'm getting a bit jealous. So if you can, order yourself some books to read on your holidays. Okay, so let's just swap back to a reminder about this show, just in case that you're unaware. This show runs every other Saturday, and that's on 1 p.m. till 2 p.m. roughly in the afternoon, and that's UK time. So please join me. I'd try to keep things consistent in terms of teaching and learning talk, and today is no different. We have Amarbeer Singh Gill with us today, and I just want to introduce him quickly before I bring him into the virtual studio. So I'm delighted to welcome him today. He's a passionate teacher, or ex-teacher, but now works with the Ambition Institute, and he's a former secondary maths teacher, by the way. He has authored, obviously, this popular book, which I mentioned before, which is Dunlosky's Strengthening the Student Toolbox in Action, super popular through John Catt Educational. He speaks regularly at some major conferences like Research Ed. I know he's done that before. And as an evidence lead in education with Greenshaw Research School. Singh focuses his application of educational theory and cognitive science to improve classroom practice. So that's why I wanted to bring him in today, because he's a like-minded person. He loves the things I love and things that work in the classroom. So I want to bring him in right now. Let's see if we can get him on stage. Singh, can you hear me?
Rookie mistake. I forgot to unmute myself.
I did that as well. Don't worry. I did that for the first time today. I was kicking myself in my head, but look, I think I got away with it.
How you doing, Jamie? You all right?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Are you on summer holidays as well?
Well, I work for our Ambition Institute, so we don't get summer holidays at the moment as such. It's a bit quieter because obviously all the teachers are off, so there's no one external to work with. But yeah, still working at the moment, but it's a bit more flexible.
Interesting. Okay. So just again, I mean, I know I've kind of given a bit of information about you, Singh, but do you want to give the viewers then just like an overview of your journey in education? Because we were talking, weren't we, just before we came on live, you know, about your journey, but it's quite an interesting one. Do you want to explain to the viewers where you're at?
Yeah, I almost, in truth, I almost like sort of fell into research-based practice. So I started training to teach about 10 years ago, give or take. And my university tutor when I was training was Peps McRae. And it's quite funny at the time because I didn't know him as, you know, Peps McRae edu guru at the time. I just knew him as, you know, Peps my uni tutor. But he was obviously a brilliant tutor, as I'm sure anyone who knows Peps can imagine. And we kept in touch after I qualified as a teacher. And he was working for what was then called the Institute for Teaching, which later merged and became a Mission Institute. And with some colleagues, some fantastic colleagues there, set up a master's program. He knew I was interested in doing some sort of master's. And so he put sort of, not so gently, like pushed it in my direction and said, this is going to be brilliant. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made. Like during that master's, got to work with some fantastic colleagues. You know, Steve Farndon, Emma Lark, Nick Rose. Yes, absolutely amazing people and learn from them. And that was really like the start of my sort of evidence-based practice journey.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So you were teaching before that, is that right?
Yes, I was teaching. Teaching during the master, so it was a part-time master. So I carried on my teaching whilst I was doing that. It's a 2-year course. Ambition of just winding down. So we've got a final cohort who have just finished it. They've just put their submissions in a few weeks ago for that master's program. So it's winding down at the moment. But yeah, it was a fantastic program.
It must be amazing to work with like-minded people who are passionate about research and passionate about education. You know, like the names you just dropped there, Peps McRae, one of them. It must be inspiring to you know, be around people who want to drive, you know, good practice and research-based practice forward.
Yeah, unbelievable. Like I regularly, whenever I go into work and like we have sort of you know, our internal professional development, like I'm just in awe of sort of conversations that take place because it's you know, it's a different level and I've learned like so much about like teaching and learning, but also like myself and sort of my beliefs and values around teaching and learning. But yeah, like just to work in an organization which is, you know, solely dedicated to improving outcomes for children, and particularly for those students who like we might say come from sort of disadvantaged backgrounds potentially. Like it's just an amazing place to work, like all driving towards that goal.
In a nutshell, can you just summarize what Ambition Institute is, just for the viewers and also myself as well? I'm a little bit unsure still. Like exactly, just very quickly, like and briefly.
Sure. So Ambition Institute is a charity. It's set up to deliver really high quality professional development to help teachers to keep getting better, with the ultimate goal of improving outcomes for all students that you know we work with, either directly, indirectly through the teachers that we work with.
Okay, is this how you got into research of John Dunlosky? Then is this how you managed to, you know, be invited to write the book essentially? Because you obviously worked with Tom Sherrington on this wonderful masterpiece.
Yeah.
So how did you get involved?
So the Dunlosky paper, Strength of the Toolbox, that was the first paper we were given on the master's program. So it's got like a really special place for me because it was like my entry into the world of evidence-informed practice, and it really, to be honest, dispelled a lot of myths for me. Like when I think of research papers, they're sort of quite stuffy, sometimes quite inaccessible. And his paper just wasn't. Like it was really accessible, it was really succinct, and yeah, I just thought it was a really helpful way for me to enter that world. And I'd read a few of the other inaction books. So I think by that point, Tom Sherrington's was come out, Ollie Lovell's was out. I think the Ensors, Zoe Mark Ensors had just released their one. And I emailed John Catt and just said, look, I think this would work really nicely. Like, what would it be? This be a possibility to write an inaction series, or an action book for around Strength in the Student Toolbox? And then Tom emailed back and got in touch, and sort of we hashed out a few ideas. We got in touch with Professor Dunlosky as well to make sure he's more than happy to support the project, and he was absolutely thrilled about it. And then the sort of a year later, we managed to get the book out.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
So did Dunlosky look over it and assist you with writing it and whatnot?
Yeah, he wrote the foreword for it, which was it meant a lot actually. I think that he'd so we sort of finished the first like full draft and got it to him. I was going to print for him to look through it and put together that foreword. And it did mean a lot, for him to take the time to read the book and to give it his support and then to write the foreword. Like, he's obviously a busy researcher, and for him to take time out to do those things and contribute to the book, it really meant a lot.
That's awesome, man. Yeah. So I mean, like, I know a lot about Dunlosky's work and Rose and Shine and different papers like that, which you've kind of drawn attention to the fact that it's quite accessible, but
For sure.
as educators yourself and myself writing teaching one pages, I've also tried to make that more accessible to teachers through the Inaction series. But just on the surface then, your book is obviously built upon an influential paper, but a lot of viewers, a lot of listeners won't know much about John Dunlosky in terms of his work. So do you want to just briefly explain the core findings of the research and essentially what this Strengthening the Student Toolbox is about?
Yeah, for sure. So to be honest, his paper, I think the target audience for his paper was really students. Like, it wasn't necessarily sort of like teaching and learning. It was, how can we support students to learn effectively? What does that look like? And essentially what him and his colleagues did, so the Strengthening Student Toolbox paper is a summary of a much bigger research paper that he did with a number of colleagues. And what they did was they looked at 10 revision strategies, like studying strategies, that either research suggests are really effective or students have said are really popular. So you've got things like highlighting in there, underlining, rereading as some of the popular ones, and you've got practice testing, distributed practice, things like that as some of the more effective ones that research has looked into and built up over the last few years / decades. And what they basically did was to figure out, well, A, what's the link between what the effective ones are and what the popular ones are, and also how effective are all of these, like, regardless of them being popular or not, how effective are they? And they grouped them into 3 categories. So, like, the most effective ones, promising strategies, and then the least effective ones. And the headline from the research was that some of the most effective strategies, so underlining, rereading, highlighting, tend to be the least effective in terms of learning, like long-term learning. And on the side, some of the least popular ones, like practice testing, ritual practice, were actually the ones that had the biggest evidence base supporting them in terms of effective learning strategies.
Why do you think the practice testing I suppose more unpopular? Why do you think that's the case? It's because I mean, from my point of view, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question here, but is it because people, I guess, in Daniel Willingham's work, he talks about how we don't like thinking, because it's quite hard. Is that the reason?
It's definitely part of it. So part of it is definitely like we just don't like thinking. Like, it is really effortful. We can feel
even though it's beneficial, right? Even though it's beneficial, right. It's tough.
Yes, yeah, right. Like, and this is like, our brain doesn't quite work in the same way as like muscles in our body, but like we can make some analogies to, like, going to the gym. Like, like, it's probably not at the time a very pleasant experience to be doing that. Like, at the very least, even if you enjoy it, it's really effortful. Like, it's exerting some effort in that process, and our bodies don't tend to enjoy exerting effort, but we enjoy, like, the rewards we get afterwards, right? Whether that be,
it's a great analogy. I love that analogy.
Right, like whether that be like aesthetically, mentally, both. Like, we really value those rewards afterwards. The difference with like some of the other study strategies is, like, because learning is invisible, it's really hard to see those rewards. So part of it is like, we just don't like expending effort. But the times, even if we like get over that hurdle and like we got to be like, right, I'm going to do some practice testing, we don't always get the rewards because, like, we'll get stuff wrong, or we'll spend ages doing it and like it just won't stick. Whereas if we do something like underlining, like, we haven't spent much effort, like, I can do it pretty passively, and B, it makes us feel really good. Like, I've just got all of this right. So, that classic one, and I was guilty of this when I was a student as well. We'll have a textbook, we'll open it up, and we'll like highlight the page, close it, and then try and recall everything we've just highlighted. And magically, like, we can do all of it, right? Like, we can just recite that whole page. And so there's a real like false sense of security that some of these less effortful strategies provide, which is really difficult to like not be tempted by. And
does that sorry to interrupt? Does that tie into Bjork's work then on performance and learning?
Yeah, exactly that. So like the idea that performance in context can mean very different things. So I might do a retrieval quiz and get 7 out of 10, but if I've really effortfully had to try, and those 7 correct answers I've got, I'll probably retain those 7 correct answers for longer than if I had just like highlighted them in a passage of text. But like on the surface of it, I've got 7 out of 10, right? Like, I've got 3 things wrong. Whereas if I highlight something and then test myself, I'll probably get like 100%, if not more than 70%.
Yeah.
And different performances, which we make inferences about our learning on, and it's really counterintuitive to say, well, the one that I've done worse on is probably going to be better for me going forward. Like, it's just really counterintuitive. And so, we're teachers, we live and breathe teaching and learning, and even for us, it might sound a bit strange. And we're asking students to like try and understand some of these strategies. It's a challenge in and of itself.
So we'll come to how you would advise to introduce these strategies to students a bit later. But are there any other strategies you mentioned? Because Donlosky categorized them into 3 areas, right? Which were most effective learning strategies, strategies with much promise, and less useful strategies. So are any of those strategies ones that we should completely avoid, or get students to completely avoid because they're completely useless, or do they all have a place?
Yeah, great. Like, and I think you've hit the nail on the head with that last bit there. Really, like, part of the conversation I had with Professor Donlosky when I was writing the book was about emphasizing like this. He really intentionally used the word like effectiveness rather than like good or bad. Like, there's no such thing as a good strategy or a bad strategy.
Yeah.
If I'm doing some practice testing and I just can't retrieve anything, right? Like, I'm just drawing blanks, 0 out of 10, 1 out of 10, whatever it is, then I'm not really benefiting from it. Like, if I can't retrieve anything, I'm not going to get the benefits of retrieval practice. And so at that point, it might actually be better for me to just go back to my notes and do some rereading and do some and like, or look at my notes and then try and put them away and test myself immediately afterwards. But the point he makes is that shouldn't be the end point, right? Like, highlighting they're really helpful starting points, or we might need even if it's called a jump start, like we're just struggling, so we need a jump start, but they can't be the only thing we rely on.
Yeah.
There has to come a point where we switch and do some of those more effortful activities, like space practice, like practice testing, like potentially interleaving if it's appropriate as well.
Yeah.
So, like, I wouldn't ever say to students, like, never do this. I think it gives a safety blanket, I think is the word that Donlosky uses in his paper. But it's not it's important to my students, like, this isn't your end point. Like, this is a starting point, might even be a jump start, but it can't be where you finish and how you like continue to do it.
Interesting, yeah, because I often, or have done before, I said, rereading, highlighting, it's ineffective, don't do it. But after reading your book and what you've been saying there, it's everything kind of has a place somewhere depending on what the context is. So that's really interesting. So let's move on to the most effective learning strategies then now, Singh, because this is the category of everyone wants to hear, isn't it? Like, what do I do in the classroom to make it as effective as possible so students learn? So practice testing is highlighted then as an effective strategy in Donlosky's work, isn't it? So can you explain why it works? I know you've touched on it a little bit. And are there any case studies, any examples you can give? Because I know that your book illustrates a lot of the, these practices with concrete examples. Do you have any of those?
Yeah, actually, the I think the one that I find most powerful is the experiment that they talk about in the larger research paper. And the one I discuss in my book as well. So what they basically did was they put students into 3 groups, and gave them a passage of text to read. All 3 students had a passage of text to read. The first group got 4 opportunities to read the whole passage of text. The second group had 3 opportunities, and their 4th opportunity was a test. And what that test was basically, write down everything you can remember about the passage of text you've just read. The final group still had 4 opportunities, but only 1 opportunity to read. So they read it once and then had 3 opportunities to test, to write down everything they could remember. After that, 4th opportunity, whatever it was, they were asked to redo that test and write down everything you can remember. And the group that got to read it, more times did better. So the more times you read it, the better you did.
Okay.
They then tested them a week later and asked them to do the same thing, and the results completely inverted. So actually, the group that got to do the least reading did the best a week later. And this, it just blew my mind, particularly because the group who could read it 4 times, they had access to 100% of the material 4 separate times. The group who could only read it once, well, all they could access was whatever they'd been able to recall the previous time. That's all they could go back and remember. So they didn't have access to 100% of the material, and yet they remembered and retained more of what they learned in the long term. And I thought that was really powerful, because there's a difference between I used to fall into that trap of I've covered it, therefore it's been learned. I think for me, that was one of the biggest takeaways from the paper and from the process of writing the book, was trying to shift my own mindset and not fall into that trap of I've covered that lesson, I've covered that part of the scheme of work, therefore students have learned it.
So how would you encourage teachers to embrace that research then on a practical level? What would you get them to do in the classroom based on that?
Yeah, I think there are a few ways of doing it. And to be honest, I think a lot of teachers probably do it without necessarily calling it retrieval practice or practice testing. I think that's fine. I don't think it has to a label on it. But one of the I'm hesitant to use the word easy, because there's rarely anything easy about teaching. But one of the ways you can do it is using a starter activity, which goes back and covers previous material, right? And teachers probably do this, like I said, quite regularly without necessarily calling it practice testing or retrieval practice. But I think the question, and it comes back to the discussion we had earlier, was those questions will ask kids to retrieve stuff, but can they? How confident are we that they will be able to be successful? And if they aren't successful, what are we going to do about it? Because if a kid comes in and the first 5 minutes of the lesson, however long that task is, they can't answer the majority of the questions, that's not the way you want to start that lesson, right? We know it needs to be effortful, we know it needs to be difficult, but
desirably difficult.
Yeah, right. It has to be achievable, right? It has to be possible. And it's a really trying to figure that out for one student is really challenging. And teachers are working in batches of 25, 30, if not more, right? And so there isn't an answer to this. It really comes down to really effective teaching, knowing your students really well and knowing your content really well. Those are the 2 questions or criteria that I think can make or break a really effective task. And even things I think a lot of schools now will do shared planning and shared resources, which I think are brilliant. Why are we getting everyone to reinvent the wheel every time? But there are some things that will be specific to your class. And so how are you adapting some of those initial questions to make sure that they're fit for purpose and that manage that tension between difficult but achievable for your particular students?
So he also, Donlowski talks about, as an effective strategy, distributed practice as well. Do you want to explain that? Because it was labelled as very effective in a wide range of situations. So why is this, and how can teachers, again, how can they implement this? Because it can be quite tricky to implement spaced practice, can't it?
Yeah. So for sure. And I think spaced practice or distributed practice is not necessarily perhaps a technique in and of itself, but it's a way of delivering other techniques. And the basic principle is that you distribute and space out the exposures to content, and I'm using the word exposure there really in like purposefully, because that exposure might be you do like a quiz that you've done previously, or it's on content you've done previously, and you do it, after a week or after a few weeks, and you do it repeatedly 3 or 4 times.
Can I just interject there,
Yeah.
Sing, for a second? Is it useful to, when you're space practice, to kind of change the context of that information, or learn it in a new way? Like, because I know that Graham Nuttall talks about been exposed to something 3 times. Am I getting confused here with interleaving, or are we still talking about space practice?
Yeah, it's a really, really it's a really great question, and I don't know if there's like the cross. There's lots of overlap here, and this is why I think I think distributed practice, thinking of it as a way of administering other strategies, is probably helpful. So whether and I'm also hesitant to put a number on it. It might be 3 times for some children. It might be once. Like, it might take 10 times for others, or multiple.
Yeah.
So the classic example is there will be people who you meet once, and like, you'll remember their names. Like, you'll just remember the names, or you'll remember a story about them, even though it only happened once. There will be other people that despite your really best intentions, you just, every time you meet, I just can't. I'm really sorry. Pat, just tell me your name again. Like, I've forgotten.
I get that all the time. Yeah.
Right. Like, it just happens. And part of the problem is often we see our brains as like video cameras that record everything and then just store it indefinitely. And actually, that's probably not the best way of thinking about our brains. So a really helpful analogy that someone once shared with me was like, it's probably better to think of our brains as a system that places bets on like what information is going to be useful to me in the future. Like, that's what they're placing bets on. And the criteria they use is, well, how often have I come across this information in the past? Because what they're saying is, if I've come across it regularly in the past, it's probably important. Like, that's why it's been exposed to me regularly. And if it's important in the past, it'll probably be important in the future. So I want to retain that. And that's really what space practice is around. It's like re-exposing and implicitly telling us and our memories that like this information is important. Make sure you hold on to it. Make sure you retain it. The exact number, what that looks like is up for debate. And like we said earlier, it might be that it's a practice test, but if you can't retrieve anything, you might just need to reread that passage from the textbook or your notes or whatever it is. So that's why I said the word exposure, because it could be that thinking, that effortful thinking. It could be rereading. It probably should be both, to be honest. But yeah, that's what sort of distributed practice is in a pretty big nutshell.
Which is it's really important for the planning phase, isn't it, of a curriculum, as to make sure that we planning ahead for a knowledge-based curriculum as opportunities for students to return and space their learning, which comes back down to collaboration and working with teachers in your department to ensure that students are not just doing it once and it's forgotten about, but they're having that opportunity to revisit. But if we talk quickly then about the strategies with much promise. So Donlosky, he labels that as his category: strategies with much promise. Interleaving, and I think it's elaborative interrogation as well, isn't it? So do you want to talk a little bit about interleaving and how it shows promise, but it's less commonly used?
Sure.
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's worth bearing in mind here that paper is about 10 years old now, and at the time, the research around interleaving was relatively limited. So part of the sort of reasoning for putting it in like this category of much promise is it's like where it has been tested, it seems really effective, but that evidence base is quite narrow in that it's quite limited, and also it's not been tested like particularly widely, so across lots of different phases and subjects. But what they said was interleaving stands to be really beneficial when you are trying to teach something that is really similar to something else. So I might be trying to teach fractions, and let's say I know inherently, because it happens every single time, students will always mix up how to do the different operations of fractions. Like, it just happens all the time. And every subject will have that thing, right? That like students will always mix these two things up, or three things, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And what interleaving does is it brings those things together. So rather than what I would have done previously, which is I would have taught how to add and subtract fractions and probably grouped those, and then taught multiplying, and then taught division, and then move on.
Yeah.
What we do now is like still teach them, but at some point is mix all of those problems up, right? So I'll give students a task which involves all four operations in a completely random order. And what it does is it forces students to retrieve the technique. So you've got like sort of the benefits of retrieval practice in there, but also it forces students to think about, well, why am I doing this technique for that question and this other technique for that other question, right? And that like compare and contrast effect is what research suggests is like the really key driver behind interleaving. And for anyone who's sort of like interested in interleaving, I'd signpost you towards Professor Jonathan Firth. He's got a brilliant blog. He's a researcher based up in Scotland, in the UK, but he's written a lot about interleaving. Like it's his area of research, and he's got some fantastic blogs that sort of delve into this a little bit more. But yeah, interleaving in a nutshell is where do students mix up really similar and related things, and how can I make those differences really explicit and force students to discern between them and between the context in which I should use one and not the other.
So would it be a case of after doing those problems and in class, like discussing those connections as well with students and, having that dialogue to make it more explicit? Because I feel like, it needs reinforcing, and to make it more explicit in terms of the actual connections students are making when they're working on these problems. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I want students to be really clear on, well, why are you doing it this way and not that way, right? So if I'm teaching them about fractions, I want them to know that like they only use a common denominator when they're adding and subtracting, and that's the only situation. So when I'm teaching them multiplication division, I'll be explicit and say, like, you are not going to use a common denominator here. That's only for addition and subtraction. It's often implied, and it's definitely something I was guilty of when I was like early on in my career, like the curse of the expertise, like things we just take for granted. Or I haven't used a common denominator in my working, so kids will figure out that you don't use a common denominator. But you're right, like we have to make that sort of thinking really explicit and really clear for our students.
Which means that you could probably embed those connections or reinforce those connections in a starter activity or a retrieval practice test. So you're kind of combining the strategies with much promise with the effective strategies as well in that case.
Yeah, absolutely. And interleaving is one where it sort of like the mechanisms that underpin interleaving are sort of potentially a bit of space practice, potentially a bit of practice testing, potentially a bit of like sort of compare and contrast. There's sort of a few different elements that to what makes interleaving really effective.
So can you talk about elaborative interrogation now, Singh? Because this is obviously something I've looked at because I've put it in my book in Teaching One Pages. And I've used it in the past, but it's one of those things that's quite tricky to implement into class. Do you want to explain what it is and maybe give an example of how it can be used?
Yes, in fact, I'm going to do what I did in the book and combine it with self-explanations.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
And again, this is one that I reckon teachers probably do, just don't put a name to it, right? And I don't think you necessarily have to. But essentially, it's getting students to think about, well, what and why. So if I'm writing an equation up on the board and I write like the next line of working, getting students to think about, well, what has happened? What's happened between the first step and the second step? Now, that might come from me, and I might explain that initially, but at some point, I want students to be able to explain that. And the reason I want them to be able to explain that is because I want them to understand why this is happening. Like, you can describe what you've seen. So, like, I've taken 4 from this side, I've taken 4 from this side. That's like elaborating on what I've done on the script on the board because it's not on there.
Yeah.
The next question is, well, why have I done that? Why have I not, added 4 or times by 4 or done something else with that 4 instead? And what we're getting students to do is to like look at the deep structures of the concepts we're talking about and beyond the sort of surface features. We might start there. We probably should start there. But if all we ever teach students is like, surface features of problems, their knowledge is going to be really limited. They won't be able to identify like the connections between concepts and across concepts because they just can't see them. They haven't been taught them. So elaborative interrogation gets students to add in additional information that isn't present in what's in front of them. So it might be tying in with prior knowledge. It might be, so if I'm teaching, let's say I'm teaching algebraic fractions, for example, and I'll simplify like an addition question and I say, why have I done this? What's been done here? Can you link it back to when we did like fractions with numbers in? I'm getting them to interrogate and elaborate on what I've done on the board by linking it to their prior knowledge. Self-explanations are then, why explaining it to themselves, why has this happened? And that's a bit tricky, because we don't know what students are thinking, right? Like they could be thinking about anything at any given point in time. And so the tricky thing with self-explanation is trying to get insight into students' thinking. And you could use mini whiteboards, you might use like peer feedback if you've got the structures there for it. But that thought process is what's important there and being able to check it.
I think just jumping in there, I think a lot of these mechanisms used to explore what students are thinking needs to be embedded in a good routine and solid routines in the classroom, doesn't it? For example, like self-explanation, if the students aren't trained in it or rehearsed it before, it can be quite a difficult thing for them to do if it's not been modeled to them explicitly and they don't know how to do that. So I guess these strategies need to be couched in that idea of embedded routines that students are familiar with and rehearse and practice. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. And really it's the premise of Donofsky's paper. Like he says in it, we spend lots of time teaching students what they need to learn, but not necessarily how they need to learn. And that's just as important. And just as, it takes time to teach students, we build up a curriculum of knowledge over time. Teaching students habits and like different behaviors also needs to be built up over time. We spoke about this earlier. In fact, Professor Jonathan Firth, his analogy for space practice is like when you're painting a wall, you need to leave time for the paint to dry before putting on your additional coats. This is the same when we're teaching students about self-explanation or all those routines. Like I want to get students into really good habits. When I say turn and talk, or when I say peer feedback and you do that, I want to know that you're talking about the exact thing I want you to be talking about. It's not just idle chit chat. It's really focused, and that can't happen in isolation. Like I need to tell students how they need to do that. I need to support them in building those behaviors and setting those expectations, and then I can start getting them to have some really high quality conversation about content, math, science, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of research on oracy recently. And lots of the research and the the good practice that comes out of that is all around those routines and teaching students how to have deep conversations. I really love what you were saying about getting at the underlying structures of knowledge as well of what students need to learn. And I think that's what elaborative interrogation does really well, isn't it? Because the why and the how questions really dig deep, don't they? And they have to really make those connections. So I do like the idea of elaborative interrogation in doing that and really accessing that underlying knowledge and recurrent themes that pop up in different contexts. I know that Daniel Willingham, again, I'm name dropping Daniel Willingham again, but he does say that in Why Don't Students Like School? That teaching students the underlying concepts and ideas, helps to connect knowledge and information together. And I really like why the explanation there of elaborative interrogation. Let's quickly move on though to the less useful strategies. Which ones does he suggest that we should not avoid but kind of like use with caution?
So there's a few in there, and there's sort of the thing is there are a few that are really common things, and I want to sort of front load this bit by saying what Professor Donofsky and what I hope I've tried to emphasize in the book is please don't stop using these strategies. Like that's not what we're saying. As we sort of Jamie and I we discussed at the start, everything has its place, and there might be times where this is really appropriate. Some of these strategies are really effective. So you've got things like underlining in there, rereading, highlighting, keyword mnemonics, and imagery for text. So those are the 5 that the research suggested were quite popular, but also potentially less useful. And when it comes to sort of underlining, highlighting, and rereading and summarizing, the reason he suggests that they are less effective isn't because they aren't helpful, is that often they aren't particularly effortful. So I can like reread something, I can highlight it and underline it pretty passively. Like I can pay attention to, you know, what's going on out the window. Summarizing is perhaps the tricky one, because he actually acknowledges that you know, summarizing can be done really effectively. The challenge is, in order for it to be done really effectively, the content has to sort of lend itself to being summarized. So it's really difficult to summarize, you know, maths equations and things like that. Like it just doesn't make sense to do it. And B, the person doing the summarizing has to be quite skilled at summarizing. Like it's a skill that takes time to develop.
Even I know that.
Yeah, right. So if you are a person, or, you know, you're working with students who, you know, you're working on a subject where A, it's amenable to being summarized, and B, your students are good at summarizing. Like summarizing is a great way to do it. And what you could probably do is do some summarizing and then do some retrieval practice on those summarizations afterwards and on those notes afterwards. The challenge is, if you don't have those two scenarios where, you know, either your subject doesn't lend itself to it or students aren't particularly skilled, the time you would spend like skilling students up into being skilled summarizers might be better spent just doing some practice testing instead. Right? There's an opportunity cost there. So those are the sort of first two. He then sort of groups keyword mnemonics and imagery for text. And again, the challenge here is, well, what am I drawing students' attention to? So sometimes mnemonics are really, really helpful. But sometimes what happens is students will remember the mnemonic, but not what the actual learning is behind it, right?
Yeah.
And so actually, we're sort of asking the question, well, is it easier for students to just remember the learning, like I can just do some practice testing and really reinforce that? Or do I want students to now remember two things, like the mnemonic and the learning that it represents behind it, or the image and the learning it represents behind it?
Yeah.
And that's a really subjective decision. Like there might be some cases where that is really helpful, and actually, you know, associating particular images or particular acronyms or mnemonics with a particular bit of learning is really helpful. But there might be a risk there of, like, you know, splitting students' attention and diverting it away from the learning that is really helpful. So, you know, there are 5 strategies. They all are potentially helpful. I guess the way to think about them is there's an opportunity cost. Like they might be helpful, but they might not be as helpful as some of the previous ones we discussed earlier.
Yeah. Excellent. That's food for thought there, Singh. James Dove's just said at the bottom of the screen, I hope this has been recorded. Yes, it has been recorded. It's definitely been recorded. And
Thanks,
I'll put the playlist on X after this. So I just want to take a mini break, Singh, because we have a word from our sponsors, John Catt. So we'll be back in, I don't know, probably a minute, 2 minutes. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. John Catt have an exceptional collection of book titles that cover a range of educational topics, ideas and research. The books are aimed at forward-thinking schools and support best practice teaching for both primary and secondary education. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. We are back. Welcome. I'm loving this conversation so far with Singh. It's so in depth. It's the stuff I love to speak about in terms of teaching and learning, what works. And I'm sure you're getting a lot out of this like I am. It's all in here. As the advert said, there's lots to choose from, but it's all in there if you want to dig in after this. Let's bring Singh back into the studio. Singh, we've talked a lot here about the strategies that work, some of that are less useful, some that have much promise. We're going to move on and we're going to talk about what am I up to, challenges and solutions. So how can teachers ensure that these strategies are not just in the classroom, but we can actually give students the skills to adopt them for lifelong learning, like themselves. How might we do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically trying to solve education in 15 minutes left of the interview, right, Jamie?
Yeah, well, in a nutshell.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, the first thing to say is it completely depends on the phase you're working with. You know, if you're working with students who are in secondary school, it's definitely going to be easier, perhaps more appropriate than in primary school. But there are, I think, a few ways to do this. And the first way is to like emphasize and do them ourselves, right? Like we are doing practice. We're getting students comfortable with being tested, with retrieval of knowledge, and we are putting the emphasis on the process and not the result. Like that's the way of communicating the value of retrieval practice to students. Like we're saying to them, I'm not interested in the number here. I'm not interested in the percentage. What I'm interested in is what did you get right? What did you get wrong? And how can we fix that? That's all that matters. So I'm not interested in how many you got wrong. I'm interested in what you got wrong so I can fix it. But that's all we want to do, right? And really emphasizing the process. Now that can be a challenge because it depends how your school set up, what the levels of freedom you have. But I think there are some like ways around it, particularly things like in the experiment I talked about earlier, like just giving students a piece of paper and saying, well, write down everything you can possibly remember about trigonometry or whatever it might be in a different subject. And then you can do some peer feedback, or you can get them to work in groups to start off with, so they can check against each other and say, is this correct? Now, obviously, the structure there has to be really important. But if we get students comfortable in school with getting stuff wrong, with trying really hard, with appreciating the journey and not the end, when they go away from school and we say, don't worry about getting it wrong, we're practicing what we preach, right? Like we've set them up to not worry about, I've got it wrong, I need to go back and do some rereading because then I'll get it all right, or I need to do some highlighting and get it all right. Like we've built that base for them to feel comfortable in that struggle. So what we can then do is, once we've built those environments, is to support students with things like, how might we develop flashcards? And again, we can always model their use in school. So we can get students to develop flashcards at home, but then we might bring them into school and say, right, you're going to work with your partner next to you, or perhaps by yourself. You've got your like keyword or cue word on one side of the flashcard. You have to try and record what's on the other side. If you get it right, it moves to the back of the pile. If you get it wrong, you put it to the front of the pile and you pick it up, in 2 or 3 cards at a time. And you just keep getting that process where students, are just doing stuff. And one of my old colleagues once said to me, they were speaking to their students, it's not about practicing until you get it right. It's about practicing until you can't get it wrong. Right? Like it's about performance and learning. Like that's what we're aiming for, is not getting it right. It's until it's like impossible to get it wrong. Like that's how well we want to have got this stuff done. So yeah, I think there's 2 things there. Like firstly is enabling those conditions in school and building that base so that when it's taken out of school, students by themselves have something to be able to work from.
Is it important for schools to like kind of set their stall and have it like, I don't know, like an assembly or some kind of workshops, or for parents even, just to set out what good learning practices are and why? Because or is it just done through osmosis through the classroom teacher? And would you have it like the present, these are the best learning strategies for your exams? We recommend to do X, Y, and Z. This is what your child is doing in the classroom. Would you have some kind of explanation about that, would you think, for a school, or do you think it's a waste of time?
Oh, it's a really good question. I think probably a bit of both. So I think there's some of it is like does need to be explicitly shared with parents, with students. Like,
well, the only reason I'm asking that is because I don't think parents or the public in general know that these strategies are the most effective, and often they might encourage their child just to reread their textbook and highlight. So I was just thinking, from a parent's point of view, would it be useful to go into the school where the child is and actually learn what the most effective things are themselves, and know about them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even if it means kids at home studying and they do some practice testing and they're getting things wrong, like for a parent to be to come in and say, like, it's okay, I know you're getting it wrong, but this is what's going to be most beneficial. Like, let's try and tweak it like this, so you're getting it right a bit more often than you're getting it wrong. But for parents to be able to do that, they need to know that retrieval practice or whatever is likely to be more effective than just getting a kid to read their notes 10, 20 times. And so giving parents knowledge, I don't think that's ever going to be a bad thing, for sure. Sharing it with students, again, I don't think that's ever going to be a bad thing. I think the challenge is in bridging what's called like the knowing doing gap, right? So where I have knowledge but I don't necessarily act on it, and I don't act on it not because I don't want to, or I even disagree with the knowledge. I might agree with it, I might even really value it, but it's just really hard to like ingrained habits that we have and then replace them with new ones. So if students are used to in school getting things wrong, when they then go home and get it wrong, it's not a big deal. If parents can support them and say, don't worry about it, you get things wrong in school, there was an assembly about it, like it just adds to helping to bridge that gap, right? You've got lots of support in place. That means you're less likely to fall back on your old habits, more likely to be pushed into the more helpful ones. So a bit of both, a bit of explicit teaching, a bit of explicit sharing, and a bit of like creating that culture that will sort of bleed out or transfer via osmosis into the students' home lives as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things we've been talking about, and in previous shows as well, all for me has just kind of come together as it needs to be kind of couched and born out in a culture where these things are the norm. It's all about the school culture, isn't it? And how leadership want students to learn and how they can facilitate that through professional development, making teachers aware of these practices. And then likewise having workshops for parents, workshops for students on best practices. So I guess it all comes back down to the school culture, doesn't it? And we were talking about that before, in the classroom and self-explanation and, getting into those underlying ideas. It's all about, being aware of the research, I guess. So I guess the last few questions then, Singh, one of them is, what advice would you give to early careers teachers about incorporating these strategies? It might be kind of a mind-blowing thing. I don't know if they learn about this in teacher training nowadays. I didn't learn any of this when I was doing my teacher training. So what advice would you give about the findings of Dunlosky's work and your research?
Yeah, I mean, early career teachers, I think now is they're exposed to a whole wealth of information about the science of learning, effective strategies that definitely, like you, Jamie, I definitely wasn't exposed to when I was trained to be a teacher, and particularly small doses. So, like the first thing I'd say to ECTs is like, you're early on in your career, like just get involved. Don't know, just establish your baseline, get comfortable in your classroom. But then go ahead, get some books, go to research area, go to conferences, and try and absorb as much information as you can, and then think really intentionally about the areas of your practice that you want to improve on and you want to get better. But pace yourself, right? Like one of the mistakes I made so the first thing I did, I got Dunlosky's paper, I read through it, interleaving sounded amazing, the examples were around maths, I thought brilliant. Monday morning, went into my classroom and tried it, and it was like an absolute car crash. Probably one of the worst I've ever taught. And it's just because I let my enthusiasm like get the better of like actually getting stuck into the research and understanding what I'm doing. If I'm talking, I can have this conversation now, like 6 years on from that failed experiment. It takes time to incorporate these techniques, and even then, teaching is like it's not a short-term process, right? So like take your time, establish yourself, expose yourself, and then like really pace yourself in terms of what you're going to try and incorporate, but also think about why. Like be really mindful of that looks good, so I'm going to try and do that. So that's what I do with interleaving. And really understand what's the problem you're trying to fix. So it might be my students keep forgetting stuff, or I teach stuff and students like have loads of misconceptions, or they don't understand it, or my students there's lots of low-level disruption. They can't pay attention to me because there's lots of talking. If you frame it around that, then when you try a solution, you have a measure of success to like measure your solution against. Like, do they now remember? Do they now understand? Are they now paying attention?
Yeah.
changes the frame of reference when you're trying stuff.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea of, kind of narrow it down to a granular thing and one thing to work on as well, and not
For
being
sure.
overwhelmed by the research, because I think some people can be, can't they? So just
Definitely.
picking out, those nuggets and implementing them in your classroom for a purpose, to solve a learning problem. And I like the instructional coaching approach in that sense, that we essentially are working towards solving an issue that's in that context or in your classroom. So I think you're tapping into those ideas there, which is really interesting. So what do you hope teachers in general and people listening or watching this show Sing, what do you hope they take away from our conversation today? If you had to name, I don't know, one thing, it could be more if you want.
It's a great question. So I think well, I'll share the thing that I found most powerful when I was researching for the book. And for me, it was that idea of just because I've taught it, it doesn't mean it's been learned. Even if I've taught it and students have been able to do it in that lesson, still doesn't mean it's been learned, because forgetting is inevitable. And I think that's probably the most powerful takeaway for me when I was researching, and how some of the techniques can then address that.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great takeaway as well. Just out of curiosity, what are you reading at the minute?
Oh, at the minute I'm reading a few different research papers, but it's more around habit change and psychology. So I'm interested in supporting schools and leaders to create environments in which teachers can change their habits and develop effective teaching strategies, or even more effective teaching strategies. So that's what I'm reading. A few different research articles in that sort of area at the moment.
Brilliant. You might have to come back on then in a few weeks.
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
Well, we've got one more comment I just want to put on the screen before we say goodbye. It's from James again. So James looks like he's really enjoying the show today. So he said, "This is outstanding. Bravo. Agree that making the mistakes is the learning. Learners need to feel comfortable and have a regular opportunities to for feedback as well." Which is a whole different podcast, isn't it? The idea of feedback. We'll probably go do another 2 hours on that. But sure. It's been wonderful speaking Sing today. It's nearly an hour gone, but where can listeners or viewers find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm pretty active on Twitter or X. If you just type my name into X, it will come up. You can also get in touch with me via LinkedIn. Fairly active on both those platforms. Probably the best places to get in touch with me.
Awesome. Thank you. And I hope everyone's enjoyed the show today. It's been a whirlwind of a conversation. I've really enjoyed it. We've got lots and lots to take from that. And I hope that, if you're listening or watching the recording, you can write some notes frantically. And I hope you go away and buy Sing's book, which is definitely worth it if you want to implement any of these effective strategies or least effective strategies, whatever they are, in your classroom. We'll just have one more comment dead quick, just a thumbs up, I think it was, or a clap. Thanks again, James.
Cheers. Big fan, love it.
Yeah, it's a big fan. Okay, Sing, thank you. I really appreciate you being on the show today. I've really loved our conversation, and I hope to connect again, and thanks again.
Appreciate that. Thanks for having me, Jamie. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, that's our show today, everybody. I just want to remind you we're back in 2 weeks on the Saturday show live, and I'll announce the guest in the coming week or so. So again, I hope you've enjoyed the show, and please go ahead and research John Dunlaski's work or check out Sing's excellent book as well. And I'll see you next time in 2 weeks.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.